I'm Curtis Knight, host of the Fishwater People podcast. In this episode, we sit down with author Erica Gies. Erica is an award-winning journalist and National Geographic explorer based in Victoria, British Columbia, and San Francisco. She writes about water, climate change, plants, and animals for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Guardian, Economist, Wired, Scientific American, New Scientist, among other publications. We explore some topics from her book, Water Always Wins, Thriving in an Age of Drought and Deluge. This is a fun read with cool examples from around the world of how people are interacting with water, all under this umbrella of what Erica calls the slow water movement. We touch on how climate change is influencing Central Valley groundwater supplies, these fascinating underground landforms called paleovalleys. We also bring in my good friend Nick Bouwes, an expert on a certain water-loving, wood-gnawing, tail-slapping critter that's quite deserving of our attention. Yes, that's right, the humble beaver. So let's get into it and welcome Erica to the podcast.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
We're excited to have you here. I've been digging into your book over the last month or so and love it. So that's really going to be the focus of what we talk about on this call. Just there's so much in there. I've read a couple of books recently by journalists, and I love the flavor of them, just sort of an investigative flavor. And your credentials, I mean, Scientific American, Nature, National Geographic, and then you have the coolest title that I think everybody would want is National Geographic Explorer. How do you get a title like that?
It's really, it's about getting a grant from National Geographic to do research. And they did fund my trips to Peru and to Kenya, the research that went into this book. I'm thankful to them for that.
So not only do you get a cool title, you get money too. Great deal. Well, the book really focuses on this phrase, slow water movement. And that's sort of the theme that runs through the whole book. So maybe just kind of set the stage about what is a slow water movement? What is that?
Yeah, I think in the dominant culture, we've really taken kind of a humans first attitude in our approach to nearly everything. And with water, that leads us to kind of see water as either a commodity if it's scarce or a threat if we're worried about flooding. And so that tends to lead to these sort of single focus interventions, like you're worried about flooding, so you build a levee, or you're worried about scarcity, so you build a dam and you bring in water from somewhere else. But in fact, these people that I met around the world, and these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, urban planners, etc., they are instead asking a different question. They're asking, what does water want? And in fact, a lot of what we've done with our development is erase water's natural slow phases. So these are wetlands, floodplains, mountain meadows, high altitude forests. You know, increasingly people are understanding that climate change is water change. And, you know, you see stories that will say, well, our infrastructure just wasn't built to handle this. But in fact, what the water detectives in my book are realizing is that our infrastructure is part of the problem. And, you know, we have really dramatically altered the water cycle. We've filled or drained as much as 87% of the world's wetlands. We've intervened with dams and diversions on 2/3 of the world's large rivers. And so in these ways, we are preventing water from having these slow phases. So you asked me what is slow water, and that's sort of the preamble. But there are different tenets of slow water projects that I came to understand. So it's protecting or restoring these natural slow water systems, floodplains, wetlands, etc. Mainstream water development tends to be centralized and handled by experts. Slow water is distributed, lots of small projects across the landscape. So it's kind of akin to the way solar panels on everyone's roof add up to a lot of electricity. And the good thing about it is it's a great opportunity. You know, it can feel like, how can we do this? It's so big. But, you know, we can start small and it's cumulative. So every little bit helps. And there's lastly, a community engagement or responsibility component. So if you have your projects distributed across the landscape, you're much more likely to have people coming into contact with them. So that means you need to engage the public either through education about what experts are doing here on the land, Or in some cases, like I discovered in my book, the communities are actively managing these projects together, like in Peru and India and other places around the world.
That whole equitable nature of the benefits that come from these types of things, I think is a really important part of your book. There are two things that I really loved about the structure of the book. One was telling the story through all these people. I think it's such a great way to do it because you relate to them. And then all these places throughout the world, you ticked off something like Peru, India, Iraq, Kenya, the UK, United States, of course. For me, having not been to many of these places, but being steeped in California, it's always eye-opening to say, wow, you know, these are the same things, same ideas, same issues that we're dealing with. And then sometimes it's like that Dutch example you gave with floodplains that we can dig into a little bit. Or, you know, they've been on this ride of trying to tame their rivers for longer than we have. So there's something to learn there. And then there's, you know, you go to a place like Iraq and the timeline really stretches out. What is it? 1,000 plus
9,000 years. Yeah.
9,000. That's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, that's one thing I just love about traveling generally, but especially for reporting is, you know, when you're in your little bubble of your own place or, you know, your own group that's managing or working on something, it's really easy to get blinders and kind of feel like there's one way and this is the way. And then you go out in the world and in fact, you find there are lots of different ways and some places have pretty good ideas.
Absolutely. Well, before we dig into some of those ideas and examples too, you alluded to this a little bit, but one phrase that you had, I think it was a heading of one of the intro sections there, was the climate crisis equals water crisis. When I think about California, and maybe it's because of my lens working for a group that does water-focused restoration projects, but it seems like the biggest influences, the biggest impacts that we see as Californians, one of the biggest, are associated with water when we think about climate change. Talk a little bit about that. Climate crisis equals water crisis here in California. What comes to your mind there?
I have that heading, climate change is water change, because that is one of the first ways that people around the world are experiencing climate change, right? They're having flood or extreme drought right in their own area. But I just want to caution that we don't blame everything on climate change, because a lot of it is down to our development choices. And so climate change is a stressor that is exacerbating, pushing our regular systems, our engineered systems to the brink. So, things that might have worked to a point in the past, we are now seeing failing increasingly often. So in California, I in the book, I say it's arguably the apex of water engineering hubris. And, it's absolutely massive, the extent to which we have corralled and constrained and manipulated our two largest rivers, Sacramento and San Joaquin, and many tributaries, and then the groundwater pumping. The good news about all of that is that, it's an opportunity for us to do things differently. If we recognize that that is part of the problem, then, aside from whether international governments agree to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which of course is very, very important, there's a lot we can do within our own regions to make ourselves more resilient to these water extremes and to buffer ourselves. And there's also a climate mitigation component. 25% of global emissions come from land use change, and these natural systems, wetlands can store 3 to 5 times more than forests. So, there's many, many layers of how this can work for us. And if I can just say one more quick thing about groundwater, especially speaking to a California audience, we have this history of imagining that groundwater is a separate, secret source of water when surface water runs low. But groundwater and surface water are connected. They are effectively the same water. And when you deplete groundwater, you are also depleting surface water, because a healthy groundwater table feeds those streams and rivers from below. And, in the West, we tend to think of streams as seasonal, running only during the rainy season. But in fact, historically, a lot of them ran year round. And it was because they were supplied by a healthy groundwater table and by wetlands and springs. So there are many, many important functions of ecological systems in terms of food supply at the base of the food chain, that carbon storage, and then that absorbing of floods and supplying of water. All of those things require a healthy groundwater table. And so if we care about long-term sustainability for ourselves, for the things that we want to do, we really need to take care of our groundwater.
Yeah, let's talk about groundwater a little bit then as we get into some of these examples. And one of the examples you talked about was here in California with the paleo valleys and really getting at that idea of how to recharge that groundwater. And we think about like a wet year like we've had, there's a drought over kind of talk. And you can look at the snowpack, great. You can look at reservoirs getting there. But then I think people forget about how long it takes to recharge our very depleted, especially after going through 3 of the driest years we've experienced ever, how depleted those groundwater and decades of overpumping, how depleted those groundwater resources are, and how do you charge, and a lot of the talk now, storage, and there's a lot of talk about storage. And when we think about storage in our community, we're thinking about groundwater. That's where the opportunity lies. We're not thinking about new dams or those sorts of things. It's about groundwater. The paleo valleys were fascinating in that way. Hadn't really heard a whole lot about them until your book. So talk a little bit about what they are and how they relate to this groundwater issue.
So the paleo valleys were created by the glaciers that came down from the north atop the Sierra Nevada. Over a period of about 1 million years, there were 4 cycles of that left a major kind of imprint on the underground of the Central Valley. So basically, yeah, they'd come down, then they'd kind of melt and retreat, and then they come down again. And each time there would be a lot more water in the system than there is today. And the sea levels were a couple of 100 feet lower. So that created kind of more gravity and more momentum. And so these ancient rivers, which are basically like the ancestors of today's rivers, they're close to where the rivers come off of the Sierra Nevada today. They carved these really deep channels in the soft soil in the Central Valley, a mile wide and hundreds of feet deep. And then later in the glacial cycle, as the ice melted and the water runoff really got going, it started to kind of scrape away some of the rock and sand and soil. And so it backfilled these canyons, once it lost momentum, with this very, very porous, they call it cobble. So, you think of lots of big rocks or sand in an area and you imagine how water goes through very quickly. And then over a longer period of time, it can seep into those surrounding clays and raise the water table over a higher area and help to heal our groundwater system. Just to give people an idea, the quantity of space that's available in depleted aquifers in the Central Valley is equal to 3 times the capacity of California's current reservoir system. So, that is really depressing as a sign of how much we have abused this resource or, undermined its ability to continue to do the things it's supposed to be doing. But, it's also an opportunity because there is a lot of space. And, in some geologies, if we don't get water in there, there's subsidence, right? And we're already seeing that. That's when the land kind of compacts and collapses, and that can damage infrastructure that's sitting on top. And, once that happens, there's no refluffing the land. It's gone. But it doesn't happen in every geology. Some places there's a lot of room to get that water back under. So the paleo valleys, you talked about the narrative of the book of being kind of like a travel log around the world as I learn more about different water management techniques. But there's also a kind of a time scenario. I start with geologic time and then move into water's relationship with microbes and then beavers and then past humans, current humans, future humans. So the paleo valleys are the geology section. And, water is doing really, really amazing things underground. And as I traveled around the world, I found, we have Western science to tell us things about what's happening down there out of sight. but I found various peoples around the world who had really incredible knowledge of the underground pathways that water was traveling in their area. I found this again and again. So people who manage water really closely with close attention to the land, they understand the role of water underground and how to use that beneficially. So the idea with the paleo valleys is that if we can set them aside for water infiltration, not build a new housing development on top of them, for example, the area covered by pavement in our cities has doubled just since 1982. That's a global statistic. So, you hear more and more, oh, cities are flooding. Well, it's because the water has no place to go. When we get these big rains, we can direct it to sit on top, and then the infiltration happens. And the most useful paleo valley, according to hydrogeologist Graham Fogg, he's emeritus from UC Davis. He's been studying these for about 40 years. Are the ones from the most recent glacial cycle, which was 18,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the reason for that is because they kind of are stacked on the underground in 3D, and the most recent ones are closest to the surface. So in a lot of cases, just, a meter or two below the surface. So very, very accessible. The problem is we only know where 3 of them are. Geologists have been searching for them using well logs. That's when you drill for oil, gas, or water, and you kind of take a soil core sample. And so then they can map the soil strata that was laid down by different periods. But they need many, many, many of those to kind of get an idea of where a paleo valley might be. So more recently, the Department of Water Resources has funded a study over 100 rural groundwater subbasins that uses a helicopter and an electromagnetic imaging system. It's sort of like taking an MRI of the underground. So they can map these different types of materials. They use electrical resistivity to tell whether it's sand or clay, and then they map it in 3D. And so that gives us a better idea of where these paleo valleys are. So if you're a groundwater sustainability agency and you're tasked with coming into compliance, if you're lucky enough to have one of these in your area, then you would do well to set that aside for a recharge zone rather than do something else with it.
So yeah, the paleo valleys are fascinating. They touch on so many aspects, like you're saying, like land use management, obviously the opportunity to recharge groundwater. The opportunity, I think, as you're describing it too, is say we have a year like we have now, where those waters have the opportunity to reach some places to recharge groundwater. You could actually direct these floodwaters, these high water years, to specific kind of recharge areas.
Yeah, that's right. And, one thing that might be needed is a little bit more infrastructure, piping or whatever, to convey them to the appropriate place. But these paleo valleys are close to today's rivers because, as I said, they're kind of like the ancestors of today's rivers. So if you're catching that water shortly after it comes down from the Sierra, you might not need a ton of pipes and diversions.
Right, because unfortunately, we are catching most of those rivers that are coming out of the Sierra, almost every one of them. Every one of them has some type of dam or storage facility on it. We're sort of touching on this idea of how do you meld the green infrastructure. I think you mentioned it this way, the green infrastructure with the gray. You're not going to return things to a natural process, but how do we do a little bit of both? So we modify our infrastructure to work more in concert with sort of the natural benefits and green infrastructure idea. And the Dutch, you mentioned they treated the flooding as like, well, it keeps happening, so we just need to build bigger levees. That didn't work.
Yeah. I think in terms of what a place ultimately comes up with really depends on the culture. And I would argue that the dominant culture in the United States and Europe needs to shift, right? We've had this very human-centric, humans are most important attitude. We still do, most of us. But, that attitude doesn't do us any favors because we undermine these complex systems that provide so many services. And we don't really acknowledge that because they're external to our standard economic systems, right? These are externalities or the ecosystem services that we don't count until we destroy them, and then we have to try to recreate them in an engineered fashion. But I do think that flood management is evolving globally. So one thing that the Dutch do is that they have this analysis where they're looking at, risk versus cost. So is this area, how prone to flooding is it, and how valuable is the human infrastructure that's there? And so, if you have an area that has less value already, that's less developed, then maybe you want to give that area to the river and then build a bigger levee in another area. And there's a really influential paper that came out in 2014. It's something like 10 golden rules of floodplain management. And number one is acknowledging that floods will happen. You cannot control or prevent all floods, and therefore you need to make space for floods. And a really good place to do that is floodplains, which evolved to absorb floods. That is, I think, an increasing area of focus. And, some places are doing interesting things. Like Washington State has this program called Floodplains by Design. And, basically they work with landowners, water managers, et cetera, farmers, just like the Dutch did. Like, let's all get together, let's hash this out, let's talk about it. We know this area is prone to flooding. What are we going to do about that? Are we going to retire some marginal farmland permanently and give that back to the floodplain? Are we going to allow farming there on kind of a rental basis, but if big waters come, we're going to sacrifice that area? So, every slow water solution is unique to its place. Every place has unique geology, ecology, and unique human culture. And so again and again, when I hear about these projects and these solutions, including with the Dutch, they involve people from various sectors coming together and spending, sometimes years in meeting after meeting after meeting, trying to figure out how to compromise on this with the acknowledgement and understanding that water needs more space. We've taken too much of water space.
Yeah, and you spoke about how you need society sort of in whole to come together and try to figure these things out. That's kind of what it requires. I was really fascinated by the China example too. You think about that where you have such a strong central government, that a potential benefit there is that pivot can maybe happen a little bit quicker. For better or worse, the government just says, this is how we're doing it. Do you see that taking place in that China example? You talked about some of these big cities really embracing more space for flood management. Is it happening at a faster pace because of that sort of top-down approach?
Yes, I think the answer is yes. There was a landscape architect, there is a landscape architect named Yu Kongxiong, and he has been doing this work of making space for water within his landscape architecture projects for a couple of decades. And about 10 years ago, the president, Xi Jinping, became aware of it and made it a national policy. And so initially there were 30 pilot cities. Now this concept is being deployed in almost 600 cities around China. And, I think in the United States, we have like 11 cities with population of more than 1 million or something like that. In China, it's like, more than 100 or 150. So the scale is really incredible. And the sponge city, which is what they're calling it, which I love, a sponge absorbs water and then it releases water. It's a great image. And the idea is basically just like, if you think of all the asphalt and concrete in the city, it's trying to make more spaces for the water to infiltrate into the ground. So whether that is floodplains along rivers, little rain bioswales in between buildings or in people's backyards or in parking lots, permeable pavement, green roofs are other ways to do that. Anyway, in China, yes, it has scaled up very quickly, but most of the projects so far, the minimum requirement was like 5 square miles or something. And, some of these cities cover 1,000 square miles. So if you read a story of like, oh, urban flooding happened in this city where they have sponge cities, well, it's because it's not big enough yet, right? It's not to scale. And, you can also look outside the city. for example, Pamplona, Spain was flooding a lot, and they found some marginal farmland just above the city on the river, and they returned that floodplain to the river. And now Pamplona doesn't flood as much anymore. So you really need to think in terms of the watershed and making space for water throughout. I will say that, China in its ambition tends to kind of develop a template and then crank it out. And you need to be careful when you're doing that with slow water, because as I said, every single place is unique. One thing that's really cool about slow water generally is that, as an individual or coming together with your community, you can do something in your own place that can make a big difference. That allows you the opportunity to do something that's right for you and your community in your own area. And I think that idea is appealing to a lot of people. I think of the Groundwater Act, where the only way it passed was to let local areas come up with management plans themselves and not have the state dictating. So, again, that might be a culture, right? Like a lot of Asian cultures tend to have a more communal attitude toward things, whereas in the U.S. we tend to have more of a independent way of doing things. But I think it can be really empowering for communities too, because it gives you the opportunity to take it into your own hands and to do something yourself or with your neighbors.
You're listening to the Fishwater People podcast from California Trout, a nonprofit organization founded over 50 years ago. We also know our work has only just begun. Now's the time to focus on the future and what we want to accomplish in the next 50 years, as the state faces more people, more wildfires, and more threats from climate change than ever before. We work hard every day to make our vision of a resilient California a reality, and we can't do it without our supportive community and people like you. To become a member or learn more about CalTrout and our work across the state, visit caltrout.org. That's CalTrout.org. As we start to wind down a little bit, though, I do want to talk about, this is one of my favorite topics. It's something that I get excited about. Beavers, these mammals that are out there, these engineers that are out there that are vastly underappreciated, I think, but a lot of people starting to wake up, especially in the river restoration community, really starting to wake up to the opportunity here. And you were in the UK, which surprised me as a place to provide some beaver examples. It's England. I think about England, the UK is being, as manicured as anywhere on earth, almost every patch of it. And natural processes are probably really hard to come by back there. But tell us what's going on in the UK with beavers.
Yeah, the beaver was completely killed and eradicated from the UK 400 years ago. So for a very long time, both humans and the landscape have gotten used to a world in which beavers don't exist. But they have held on in mainland Europe and some places, and they have been making a comeback just as they have been in North America after the same thing happened to them here. It's a different species than our North American beaver. But in the UK, they're using them to prevent flooding. And I just love that example because so many people, that's kind of their knee-jerk response of like, oh, we don't want beavers here because they're going to flood our house. They're going to cause flooding. And so the idea that beavers are actually helping to prevent flooding, I thought was really intriguing. And basically it's because beavers slow water. Some researchers in the UK have quantified how much they're slowing. So this one study found that peak flows were 30% lower on average, leaving beaver dams than in areas without beaver dams. And this was true even in saturated midwinter conditions. So extremely useful. And the beavers that are there now, there are some who have been reintroduced under, official studies or trials. And then there were some that were released illegally by people who wanted to see the changes that they could make on the landscape. And I call this guerrilla beavering. But in fact, now after a successful 5-year trial that showed the many benefits that beavers bring, they've been given the blessing by the Environment Agency. And so it looks like they're going to be allowed to stay. And they're also talking about ways in which more beavers could potentially be brought into other areas.
Now we're going to pull in Nick Bouwes, an aquatic ecologist who has been at the forefront of efforts to reintroduce beavers back into watersheds here in the Western United States. He's an adjunct faculty at Utah State University, which is where we met a couple decades ago, and he has 2 consulting companies that focus on natural process-based restoration. Nick, thanks for joining the Fish, Water, People podcast.
My pleasure.
So tell us, why beavers?
So I was working in the Columbia River Basin, and I was introduced to Bridge Creek as a place where Michael Pollock was doing some work. And what he was looking at is how beavers can, by building dams, can capture sediment and raise a stream that's been downcut and try to raise that stream back up and connect it to its floodplain. And so when we designed this big experiment to do restoration, and I was just blown away about what beavers can do.
Talk about the fish aspect of it too. That's something we didn't really touch on with Erica, but the fish benefits, because I think some people will look at a beaver dam and go, "Whoa, that's a fish barrier, and that's a problem." I know some fish state management have really centered on that really false idea.
Yeah. So the idea with this particular study, and since then we've done a lot more work, was to look at if we helped beavers by building some structures, could they help us restore a watershed and make it better for fish? And so we did it. We spent a lot of time monitoring the fish response. And, immediately after we put in some structures, beavers just started using them and building on them. And, we had about 150 dams almost immediately that beavers just started building. And we looked at fish numbers, in particular juvenile steelhead, and we saw a massive increase in the number of juvenile steelhead that were being produced. We saw an increase in their survival rates, and we did some, more detailed studies to see that they were using all different parts of these beaver complexes, these deep ponds. There's a lot of differences in temperature vertically and horizontally, and they can move back and forth. There's differences in currents and things like that. And what we also measured was whether these dams provided a migration barrier. And yeah, we really didn't see any evidence of that. We saw, the adult steelhead getting past all the beaver dams. So there was about 150 and then another 100 or so structures. So there was like 250 structures that they were getting over.
Wow.
And we also looked at juveniles, and we even we tagged a lot of these fish with these passive integrated transponder tags or pit tags, that, the RFID tags that you put in your pet. And we put antennas on either side of a beaver dam. We could see juveniles going back and forth across these beaver dams multiple times a day. And we've done some studies up here in Logan, Utah, to show that they're just really not a barrier to a lot of trout species. And, the other thing that a lot of people think of when they think of beaver dams is maybe it's going to heat up the water and make it too warm for fish. And we actually saw a general cooling of the water, because what happens when those dams fill up, you create this hydraulic head that forces water to go into the hyperreach or the groundwater area and come out downstream a lot cooler. I'm not saying that happens everywhere, but that's something we've observed. And we also observed that, they just slow the water down, they spread it out. It causes the groundwater to recharge, and that happens during these higher flows. And then that water is slowly released throughout the summer. So you just see this increase in duration of flows, of adding to the base flows. And basically, when these beavers build these dams, they just build a lot more fish habitat. And then it's kind of the magic water where, how did we create this much water? You just slowed it down, and then that allows it to spread out and create these big ponds. And we saw massive benefits to these juvenile steelhead. And since then, we've seen similar results in other places.
Well, and one of the parts of that, so say the idea of trying to reintroduce beavers into watersheds. I mean, one of the problems is the habitat isn't quite receptive for them. I think you really helped establish this really innovative idea, BDAs, this beaver dam analogs that I think you really helped develop.
We did develop these in Bridge Creek. And it wasn't just me, it was, colleagues as well. Yeah, we call them beaver dam analogs, BDAs, and that term kind of stuck. And, I think people do give us credit for inventing BDAs, but honestly, they've just been called different things. There's a Forest Service manual from the 1930s, and they're building similar structures. They're putting posts in, they're weaving branches in, and they even have some of the same guidelines, like don't build too big, too fast. But, it is a way for people that are more risk averse, try, okay, what's the impact of these beaver dam analogs that are meant to mimic beaver dams and promote the same processes that beavers kick off? You could have a soft start with these beaver dam analogs, and they can also be used to, like you said, modify the habitat that's there, or the setting a little bit to provide benefits to beavers. So like in Bridge Creek, the whole water table dropped and the riparian vegetation was no longer connected to the water table. So a lot of that vegetation died. And so there were beavers in Bridge Creek, and they were building dams, and it was capturing sediment and bringing that stream bottom back up, but they were building with really small material. And so they would blow out every year. So we built these BDAs to help them out. And so they were more stable structures, and they just took to them right away, and they started building on top of them. And we've also used them. So I'm the director of the Beaver Ecology and Relocation Center here at Utah State University. And when we released beavers, we build them a BDA so that they have a deep pond to get established in and provide some refugia from predators. Beavers, if they get thrown into a system that's just shallow water everywhere, they're just, I use the term walking hot dogs for predators, because they're kind of clumsy, but they're really graceful in deep water and they can evade predation. And so we did do a release in a stream nearby here at the request of a rancher who wanted beavers to try to restore flows to a stream. The stream was drying up every year, and he came up with the idea of releasing beavers because when he was a kid, there were beaver ponds there, and it flowed all year round when he was a kid. And then he's like, oh, maybe this is the answer. He tried to release beavers and on his own before meeting us, and they didn't take. So he called us, and we're like, well, let's build some ponds, and then they can get going. And we released 5 in 2015 and 6 in 2016. And by 2019, there was 140 dams.
Wow.
And they increased the time that the stream flowed by over 40 days on average. Then 2019 was the first time in 40 years it ran all year round. And we saw with that a 10 to 50-fold increase in the amount of cutthroat trout in the stream.
Well, and you're talking about like an 8-year period.
Like a 3 or 4 year period.
It's incredible. That's incredible. One thing about those BDAs that is so fascinating is, I know you've really embraced this aspect of them as low engineering, using materials that are on site. So you can do them relatively inexpensively. You can do them in remote areas. You can slap up 1, 2, 3, whatever you think you need. That's a real attribute of these.
Yeah. And the idea is that we don't need this big, heavy machinery. We don't need super complicated, highly engineered designs. We're just giving the stream the tools to do the work, and then the stream decides what it needs to do. And one of the things that has impaired a lot of streams worldwide is, in the U.S., it was the removal of beaver. We made them go nearly extinct. And then the removal of a lot of large wood. We cleared land for agriculture. We took the timber and made houses. And then there was actually times where we just cleared the stream because we thought wood wasn't a good thing in streams. We've lost a lot of structure, and structure is what we're trying to get back in there to give the stream the tools to do what it needs to do. And if you can get beavers in there, they are just amazing. They work 24/7, and they just keep the system going.
I've been following people in Washington state and the West who are returning beavers to the land to try to help heal streams. They were really across all of North America up to the tundra. And right now, very rough estimates are that their population is maybe 10% of what they were historically. So it's extremely degraded. And in fact, 10% of North America was beaver created wetlands. So it was a much, much wetter, boggier continent with all of the life that comes with that. And because the trappers came first and killed the beavers, by the time settlers arrived, the land was already drying out. And so our perception of what's normal, even passed down through our stories, is inaccurate. And yeah, beavers are keystone species. They provide habitat and resources to hundreds of animals, including their predators. There was a beaver biologist I talked to who had put up camera traps by a site where they were planning to release beavers. And, you know, in 1 or 2 years, I think, you know, she caught a squirrel or two. And then after they put in the beavers, there was mountain lion, there was bobcat, there was everything, you know, everything comes to the water. So I think people don't really appreciate the extent to which we have really desiccated the land. Like, what does a natural water body look like? And we don't really know. And that's something I learned while reporting this book. You know, we think of these straight, neat channels, but in fact, rivers meander and beaver ponds are these complex, messy wetlands, messy to our eyes. There are ribbons of trees that line these areas and ribbons of animals that use them as corridors. Anyway, that's one thing we've done to dry out the land. Also, like overgrazing, overforesting. And in all these ways, we're actually decreasing water availability. You know, 40% of rain over land on average comes from plant transpiration. So, you know, when we dry out the landscape, we're also reducing rain. And as snowpack melts, beaver ponds can play a really important role in holding that water in the way that snowpack does. So there was a researcher in Washington state who was reintroducing beavers to areas and found that just in the first year, the ponds stored 75 times more water above and below ground than in a 100-meter section of stream without a beaver pond. So I think, you know, when we're deciding on projects, we really do need to be counting these various benefits and also like avoided costs. So there have been some interesting analyses looking at like, well, if you conserve this last wetland, you know, how much does that save us in avoided costs? Because it gives the water someplace to go. And so you're reducing flooding of nearby properties. And this one study I looked at found that return on investment is usually less than 5 years. So if a community decides, you know, we're not going to grant that developer a permit, we're going to set that aside as a wetland, it really does pay dividends. These systems are so complex and they do so much if we give them space to do their thing. And, you know, we've caused a lot of damage, but nature really is very resilient. And if we step back and if we give it space, it can do all these wonderful things for itself, but that we benefit from as well. I hope people can get curious about water on an individual level, because I think, you know, with our centralized system, we kind of take it for granted. You know, we get clean water when we need it. Our sewage is treated. But I think there is a lot of water anxiety, and that's growing as we have more and more problems with it. You know, if you can stop and ask, what does water want, and make space for water, I think that can do a lot of good.
Thanks so much to Erica Gies and Nick Bouwes for joining us on this episode, and as always, thanks to Wilco for our theme music. I'm Curtis Knight, Executive Director of CalTrout and your host of the Fishwater People podcast. This episode was produced, edited, and engineered by Bridget Shaw and Drew Alvarez with help from Stacy Michelson here at Trout Camp Studios in Dunsmuir, California, along the banks of the beautiful Upper Sacramento River. Thanks for listening.